very nice talking with all of you today. I did a lot of my research on sexuality and specifically on hookup sex. Most of what I looked at is both the hookup sexual behaviors, but also kind of the niche that my research was focused on was on religion and hooking up and kind of how those two interact. So I know a whole lot just about the behavior and the psychology around hooking up, but then I'll also kind of at the end of the lecture get into some of the specific research that I did around the intersection of religion and spirituality and hookup sex. So thank you for your time and your attention. I'm thankful to to your Professor Gordon for letting me lecture to you today. All right. So what is hookup sex? I'm sure we've all heard the term hooking up. And what if somebody comes to you and says, oh, I hooked up, or oh, that couple, they hooked up? What does that mean? It can mean so many different things. And so one thing we have to remember when we're talking about hookup behavior is that it's very much has a lot of connotations. It's very tricky to define for that reason. But it also makes it really relevant and really interesting. So when we think about hookup sex, some people think of it as totally uncommitted, no strings attached kind of sex. Some people think of it as any kind of sexual encounter with another person. Can a boyfriend and girlfriend hook up? Or does it have to be strangers? And what kind of sexual behavior constitutes a hookup? Does it have to be actual sexual intercourse? Could it be, oral sex or genital touching? Or does even kissing count as hooking up? Probably depends on the age of the person you're asking, the generation in which they grew up and talked about this kind of term. And it may even differ among your own friends and people you know. It may even differ on this campus. So it's difficult to describe hooking up, but it's really important to do to understand what it might be before we can do any kind of research or get any kind of information about how often does this happen, what does this look like, and how does it affect people. And that's mostly what my research has been focused on is how it affects people. So Garcia and Reber in 2008, they did this big kind of review paper of all the different studies of casual sex, hookup sex, things that used kind of this uncommitted sexual behavior kind of terminology. And what they did was they went through and kind of figured out what are the general themes of what hookup behavior, or what used to be called back in the old days casual sex, what does that mean? And so they kind of came up with this loose definition that most studies and most people when defining hookups kind of used. So that definition is what you see here, consensual sexual activities with a partner outside of a dating or romantic relationship. And also without the expectation of a future romantic relationship. So let's go through that again. So of course, first of all, this has to be consensual, meaning that both parties wanted it. It can be any kind of sexual activity, but with a partner. So masturbation wouldn't be considered hooking up because it's not with a partner. Typically, we're seeing this outside of a dating or romantic relationship. The tricky part is that some people may hook up prior to getting into a romantic relationship. And it might even be the hope of some people, and we know by research that it is, to use hookup sex to get into a relationship with a partner. But technically, once that becomes partnered behavior and you have that commitment, researchers would not consider that to be hookup sex anymore. Now, colloquially, would people? I don't know. You'd have to ask. But as far as this definition of the behavior, we're saying outside of dating. And the other thing is, typically we'd want to see it without the expectation of a future romantic relationship. So sometimes early in the dating years, early in the dating game, people might kind of be in this hazy pre-dating or talking phase. But there is definitely some mutual interest there, some kind of talking about getting into a relationship. And so a lot of researchers are saying, no, this is really no strings attached. This is really sex that is not in the context of we're going to become partners, although that could accidentally happen down the road. We've all seen the movies. but generally we're talking about without that expectation being there. The final point here is really important because this can be a game changer depending on what is classified as hookup sex and what isn't. So we're saying, Garcia and Reber are saying that hookup behavior really includes any sexual behavior. This can include both non-genital behavior like kissing to any kind of genital behavior all the way up to sexual intercourse. So this could be a broad range, including any kind of sexual behavior, even if it's not intercourse. So this is from one of my studies, and I, because of this definition, actually, instead of asking people if they'd hooked up, I'd ask them if in that context, outside of a romantic relationship, without the expectation of a relationship, had they done any of these activities outside of that, in this context, with a partner, but not in a committed relationship. And what you see here is all the different sexual behaviors, kind of ranging from kissing and making out, through touching, genital stimulation, all the way up to oral, vaginal, and anal intercourse. And so what we actually see is that people say they do all these kinds of behaviors outside of a committed relationship, so in a hookup context. And what we see is that the lower level sexual behaviors like kissing, making out, touching, all of those are the most prevalent. And as you get into kind of more of the intercourse kind of behaviors, those are the least prevalent outside of a committed relationship, so in that hookup context. So the difficult part here, though, is how do you say how prevalent is hookup sex if we're seeing that it's much more prevalent when people are just talking about hookups as making out or touching or genital stimulation than when we're talking about things like vaginal intercourse or anal intercourse. So that's going to play into what we're defining as hookup sex and how many people say they're having it. So as far as prevalence rates, we're seeing a big range because of what we just talked about. We're seeing a range from around 40 to 65% of college students reporting having hooked up at some point in their lifetime. And prevalence rates are really going to vary based on how the study defines hooking up. So if I ask you if you've had intercourse outside of a committed relationship with a partner, that's going to be on the lower end. So maybe more like 35 to 40% of people might report that. But if I say, have you had any of those behaviors that we talked about before, from kissing and touching, if we include those, we're going to get more up to that 65%. So that's kind of where we see the difference. You're also going to notice as I go through this presentation today that almost all of the research that we're talking about is on college students. And that may not be surprising in some ways because there's definitely been a hookup culture on college campuses for some time now, at least 15, 20 years. And so there's definitely been time to notice it and to study it. And it makes sense, right? It's a time when there's a lot more freedom, yet people haven't settled down and formed committed partnerships yet for the most part. While we do know that a lot of college students are in committed romantic relationships, there's also a large percentage that are not having committed relationships or having these sexual encounters in uncommitted contexts. So that's part of why college students are the biggest population it's studied in. Now, that's not to say that hookup sex only happens on college campuses or only happens for adolescents and young adults. We know that there are definitely these kinds of behaviors going on in middle adulthood and in adolescence, but they're harder to get at and they're harder to study because we just don't have as much access. So college students like yourselves often get credit for participating in research studies. So it's kind of a double whammy effect. Both it's mostly more prevalent in this population, in this generation, at this age, and then also there's just greater opportunity to study college students. Now, are young adults not on college campuses hooking up? Absolutely. And we're starting to get some research into that. But again, just our access to that population isn't as good. So you'll notice a lot of the time when I'm talking about prevalence rates or I'm talking about hookup behavior, I'm talking about college students. So I just wanted to talk about why. So that's generally why it's mostly with college students. And I will admit, I actually studied college students back in 2016, 2017, when I did my master's thesis. That was on this very campus. So a lot of the numbers you're going to hear from me today are actually from students from BGSU, who most likely at this point are alumni. But it can be interesting to know that this is actually from where you're going to school, this actual area, this demographic. So keep that in mind as I present any of the kind of research that I did. It's definitely with BG students. So a couple other points on prevalence. So we talked about how generally prevalence rates can vary from 40 to 65%, depending on how liberal we're going to be with the term sexual behavior. So if we're talking about kissing and touching, more around 65%. If we're talking about intercourse, we're down more around 35-40%. We also see differences in prevalence rates for men and for women. So typically we see that men hook up more frequently than do women. And then we're going to get into all kinds of reasons for why that might be the case. In my study in 2017, looking at the college students who, one of the criteria to be in the study was that you had to have ever engaged in hookup behavior. So at any point in your lifetime, you have done this. So of that group who've all done this at some point, 73% of men and 73% of women and 83% of men reported engaging in some kind of sexual behavior in the past year in the context of a hookup. Women reported about 4 to 5 lifetime hookups. And now this is just women who've ever hooked up. So we're not including all those women who say, no, I've never hooked up. But 4 to 5 lifetime and 2 in the past year. And then of all the men who said they'd ever hooked up at least once, they had about 7 lifetime hookups and 3 to 4 in the past year. So this gives us a really good sense of averages. This gives us a good sense of people who are in the kind of the hookup culture. This is something that's in their repertoire of behavior. You know, what do people do? How much do they hook up? And we see a significant difference that men tend to hook up more frequently across their lifetime and in the past year than do women. Okay, so some of the things that can be related to hookup behavior are things like alcohol use, and we also want to look at things like risky sexual behavior and then adjustment. So starting with alcohol use, we know from a lot of studies that alcohol use tends to be involved in a lot of the decisions to engage in hookup behavior. This most certainly does not mean all decisions are motivated by alcohol use, and most certainly people can decide to have uncommitted sexual encounters without being intoxicated, for sure. However, research has shown that about 60 to 65% of people who have hooked up report drinking alcohol before doing so. And typically the average is about 3 drinks. So we know that that is actually enough to have you be intoxicated. And if that's the average, we know some people are drinking less, maybe 1 or 2 drinks, and some people are drinking a whole lot more. So it might be binge drinking 4+ drinks. So what we know based on that is that the majority of college students who are hooking up are somewhere between mildly to even extremely intoxicated before hooking up. And this is important because it does have something to do with a lot of the things we talk about. So we're going to talk about the emotional reactions and the psychological reactions to hooking up. And those may differ if alcohol use, especially heavy alcohol use, was involved in that decision. As we know, with alcohol use, inhibitions are lowered, and so one may feel more free and more able to engage in things they might otherwise not. So for some folks, it might be part of the fun and part of the experience, and for others, it might be something that they regret and might lead them to make decisions that they might otherwise not have. So that's why we look at alcohol use as kind of related to hookup behavior. Also, one really important point to bring up with that is consent. So if people are hooking up, we did say that one of the requirements is that both parties are consenting. And if one is extremely intoxicated, we know that consent isn't possible. So that's just something that is important to think about when we talk about alcohol use and its relation with hookup sex. Some of the other things to think about, again, with lowered inhibitions, possibly while using alcohol or other substances, is risky sexual behavior, so like unprotected sex. So we do know from research, a lot of the studies have started asking about condom use during hookup intercourse specifically. So we know that not all hookups involve intercourse, and so some of these behaviors may not be risky at all without protection. But we would say that during any kind of intercourse, because of the contraction of STIs or the risk of pregnancy, depending on whether it's who's involved in the hookup sex, we know that there's some risk involved there. So either STIs, pregnancy, or both. And so we do know that from studies, they show that about 30 to 50% of people who hook up, college students specifically, say they didn't end up using a condom when having hookup intercourse. So that's a pretty large percentage, a third to a half, saying that they did not do that. And that can also lead to some regrets or some mixed feelings about hooking up if some risk was involved and perhaps was not planned in that way. So just something that's important to talk about when we think about this. And then the other part that is something that I did do some of in my study is looking at psychological, psychosocial adjustment. So this just means, are there any links from hookup behavior to things like depression or symptoms of depression, anxiety, loneliness, self-esteem. And so what I put here on this slide is that you'll see it's a complex relationship, and we'll get into why when we start talking about people's reactions to hookup sex psychologically. It's really not as simple as if you hook up, then you're more likely to become depressed. We know that there's so many mediating factors. There's so many things that could change how one feels about having hooked up. And so oftentimes in the past, a lot of the research studies would kind of frame hooking up as either a positive, good behavior or as a negative, risky behavior. And they would look at it from one of those two mindsets. And so some of the studies would include variables like depression and self-esteem and suicidal ideation, trying to kind of see if hookup sex could really be very negative for people. But what's important to note is that we know this is a two-way relationship, right? Anytime we do research and look at correlations, we have to know that it could go either way. So there's some evidence, some studies have found some small links between hookup behavior and depression, self-esteem, anxiety, loneliness. At the same time, most of those links are bivariate, meaning they're cross-sectional, it could go either way. And so we could see that people who are experiencing more loneliness or more problems with self-esteem, more depression, may end up seeking out hookup behavior due to that. And it may not be the hookup behavior that's causing that. It could go both ways. So that's just an important thing to think about when we talk about the impact of hookup sex. And we'll get into more of the nuance there because there is quite a bit. So here's kind of where we start thinking about the nuances of hooking up. So this is the part I find really interesting. Yes, we want to know the prevalence rates. Yes, we want to know what behaviors constitute a hookup. But once we have that down, what's the point? To me, the point is to better understand how this impacts people psychologically. So, we've all seen the movies, No Strings Attached and things like that, where the characters hook up and they think they're going to be fine, but then they end up becoming very attached and wanting more. And so researchers were kind of wondering, how does this happen? Is this how it works? Can people genuinely hook up, have sex, or engage in sexual behaviors in an uncommitted context and truly enjoy that and be happy? Or are people upset, regretful, and what kind of are the repercussions of having hooked up emotionally and psychologically? Well, of course, with anything related to sexuality, it's going to vary depending on the person and the situation. And so some researchers, primarily Owen and his colleagues, and then also in my study I looked at this as well, but they kind of gave me the idea. They kind of looked at what are your emotions the day after a hookup. So that's what they asked college students. Okay, you had a hookup encounter, think of your most recent one, and then think of, how much you experienced these different emotions. And they gave them a checklist. And so what they saw is actually there was a mix. People didn't check off all positive and other people check off all negative. That was very rare. For most people, there was a mix of positive and negative emotions about their most recent hookup experience. So when we look at this, we do need to break it down into gender though, because we do see differences between men and women on their emotional reactions to hooking up. And we'll talk more about why in a little while. So as you see here, you'll see that for women, 26% had mostly positive reactions. So a majority of what they checked off on that list were positive emotions. 50% of men had a majority positive reaction. So you can see a pretty big discrepancy there between men and women. Negative, mostly negative, majority negative reaction to hooking up, 49% of women and 26% of men. So again, we see that big difference in gender. And then we also see that third category, ambivalent. So just as many negative as positive emotions represented when they did that checklist of different emotions. So we see 25% of women and 24% of men. And in this study, we did see that negative emotions after a hookup were associated with greater alcohol use, greater depression, and greater feelings of loneliness. So this is kind of the new move in research, is not just looking at the hookup behavior itself, how much are you hooking up, and then how are you feeling? Are you depressed or lonely? It's asking, okay, if you're having negative emotions after hooking up, and that's associated with that hookup experience, what does that end up contributing to your mental health? So that's kind of the step that Owen and Fincham and the rest of their colleagues kind of made to remove it from just the behavior to the emotional reaction about it, and then thinking about how that could impact you. So in my study, I found very similar results using a similar checklist of positive and negative emotions about their most recent hookup. And again, most people experienced a mix of positive and negatives. Women, again, I found very similar results. They tended to experience less positive and more negative emotions related to hookup sex than men. And another thing to think about with some of these emotional reactions is, what about thinking about a future committed relationship? So for how many people is this short-term, uncommitted sexual behavior really enough and really what they're looking for? Or for how many is there really this hope that, okay, if I engage in this could lead to something more long-term? And Paik did a study and found, and of course this is just one study, but found that almost half or more, 45 to 65% of college men and women hope for a committed relationship after a hookup. And so we know there's at least some group who is having this kind of short-term, uncommitted sexual experience, who are then kind of wishing and hoping that this would lead to something more committed, like a dating relationship. And that can also contribute to some of the negative emotions, like disappointment. And we'll talk more about that on the next slide. Again, some of the gender differences, just to kind of get into more detail about what kind of emotions were people checking off, not just positive and negative. So for women, their highest positive emotions, most endorsed about their hookup, were happy, pleased, and satisfied. And their highest negative, their most endorsed negative emotions, were guilty, confused, and regretful. And we'll talk more about those feelings of guilt and regret Confusion, though, again, could come in with what we were just talking about. Confusion about where do we stand? Confusion about, is this short term or could this be long term? For men, they had similar highest positive emotions, slightly different order, but the same top three: pleased, satisfied, and happy. And their highest negative emotions were guilty, disappointed, and regretful. So just slightly different for men. Again, remembering that women and men did have a lot of differences. Women had more negative emotions and fewer positive, but the content of what their emotional experiences were actually quite similar, which is really interesting. One difference that we did see is that women tended to experience greater feelings of regret, greater feelings of being used, and greater feelings of confusion. They endorsed feeling less happy and less adventuresome, satisfied, proud, and hopeful than did men. So we're definitely seeing kind of this feeling of regret and confusion overtaking anything like adventure and satisfaction for women. But again, it's complicated. Women are experiencing positive emotions too. So it's going to depend on the person. Another group, this included Owen as well, but Strokoff, Owen, and Fincham did a study in 2014, and they tried to take the emotional reactions that they saw and kind of group them by, okay, these people had very similar types of reactions, very similar patterns, and what we can do is an analysis where we can break people into categories or groups based on how they responded. So what they did is they polled college students about their emotional reactions to their most recent hookup, and they ended up with 4 categories. And so you see them here. They gave them fun names, which is wonderful. So they have the happy hopefuls. So about 32% fell into that category in their study. And these were the folks who had the most positive and least negative emotions. They generally had positive experiences and felt hopeful about the future as far as their sexual behavior. The other one I really find interesting is the content realist. So that was 30%. They had some positive emotions. They had some negative emotions too. So they're a bit more ambivalent, but they had very low levels of confusion. So to them, there was kind of a sense of, this might not be exactly what I want, and I'm not just 100% happy about it, but I understand what's happening here. This is exactly what I thought it was going to be, and I'm not disappointed, and I'm not confused about it, but it's not exactly everything I wanted it to be. So we have that content realist group. And then we have the used and confused group. So that's a group, about 24% of college students had this pattern of fewer positive emotions and greater feelings of emptiness, confusion, and being used. So it's kind of, like the content realist, but the opposite, having all these feelings of confusion, feeling like they were just used by their partner, and feeling very, kind of empty afterward. So we could see how that might be linked to a lot of negative emotions, and that might be linked to, possibly some of those outcomes as far as depression, loneliness, things like that, and talk about that in a minute. The last group, disappointed and disengaged, 18% fell into that category. They had the lowest positive emotions and the highest negative emotions. These were the ones who really, really had strong feelings of disappointment. And it seems like they might even disengage from the hookup behavior kind of culture because of their experiences. So if we look at this, it's really helpful in kind of differentiating. People are going to have variable experiences with hooking up, and their reactions emotionally are going to reflect that. Is this somebody who this was a fun, adventurous thing and exactly what they wanted? A happy, hopeful. Is this somebody who this isn't really what they want, but they're okay with it and they understand what hooking up is? Is this somebody who wants something more and feels like this one night or this short-term relationship just isn't what they wanted, and so now they feel used and they feel confused about it? Or is this somebody who's just really disappointed, just not getting very much at all out of this experience, and they're just maybe going to take a step back? So it's a really interesting study. It gives us a good perspective on, different reactions to hooking up. Important to note that in looking at this, they did find differences in psychosocial adjustment based off of which group you were in. So the happy, hopeful, and content realist clusters showed less depressive symptoms and less feelings of loneliness than the used and confused and disappointed and disengaged clusters. They also showed higher levels of social adjustment. So again, we talked about this being bivariate, right? Cross-sectional, the arrow pointing both ways. But it does help us at least get some direction and some theory behind why are some people having such negative outcomes from hookup behavior and other people seem to be doing just fine, and it might be exactly what they're looking for. How do we stop judging hookup behavior as good or bad, right or wrong, and finding that for some people it fits and for other people in different contexts it might actually be very detrimental. So this is kind of a nice way to start doing that. When we think about uncommitted sexual behavior, hookup sex, and we see these feelings of guilt, regret, shame, it's hard to miss. Sometimes we have the confusion and things like that, but a lot of what we're seeing is guilt and regret and feelings of shame, and those are the negative emotions we're seeing about it. And, in studying this, we naturally ask, where are these coming from? Why are people feeling this way about hooking up? Now, of course, not everyone's feeling this way, but those folks who are, where is that coming from? And so theory supports 3 pretty general reasons why, and there could be others. These are 3 of the most known reasons why people could be experiencing these negative emotions after a hookup. The first one we saw is alcohol use. We already talked about that pretty much, but generally people are having lower inhibitions. They're making decisions during a time when they're not fully themselves. And for some people, these decisions might end up being exactly what they wanted to do, but for other folks, this might be something that they weren't wanting to do. And because they were uninhibited and they were intoxicated, they might make a decision that the next day or a week later they really, really regret. So kind of the more impulsive decision making going on when one's intoxicated could lead to some feelings of regret. The second one is gender differences and the sexual double standard. And so we're going to talk more about that on the next slide. And the third one is conflict between the cultural norms of this generation around sex, hookup sex, the whole hookup culture becoming more normative, and the more established and traditional religious and moral norms about sexuality. We definitely see that there's a clash there. So that's the majority of where my research was focused around hookup sex, was around the religion and morality side and how that impacts people. So we already talked about the first reason, the alcohol use. The second reason, the sexual double standard and gender differences, this is really an important point to understand. So the sexual double standard means that men and women have different standards put on them around sexual behavior. And this may be something you've already started to talk about in this class. I hope so, and I hope you continue to. But we saw, in the 1950s, both men and women, culturally, there was just a greater sense of sexual permissiveness that started happening. Of course, people were having sex, and we think people were having uncommitted sex for a long time before this. But culturally, it wasn't okay to talk about it, and it wasn't going to be seen on TV, and it wasn't going to be acceptable. So sexual permissiveness increased in the 1950s for both men and for women. However, we saw that there was a greater increase in how acceptable it was to be sexually kind of more permissive. So basically saying sex outside of marriage, sex in contexts like uncommitted sexual behavior. And the sexual double standard basically means men have always had greater sexual permissiveness than women, which then leads women to have more negative emotions about sex than men, because women are getting more attention for being equally sexually permissive as a man. So what does that mean? So basically, if a man had 2 or 3 different sexual partners, he might be lauded as, kind of very powerful, very successful. And if a woman were to do that, there'd be terms like she's, what kinds of names are women called when they do that? Slut, whore, all those kinds of things. She's easy, right? For men, there's not really that kind of shaming going on. So we see much more shaming and more negative judgment toward the same exact sexual behavior, and we see this with hookup sex too. So for the same exact behavior, if a man does it or a woman does it, women are going to get more negative judgment. They're going to get much more judgment than a man for the same type of uncommitted sexual behavior. So we can see why then women might have more negative emotions, even internally, than men about uncommitted sexual behavior. So women, having heard and seen other women being judged this way, then judge themselves. And may, in fact, in the past themselves have been judged, but internalize this sense of, this is wrong, this is not something I should have done, and feel regret and feel shame. So that is what we mean by the sexual double standard. And if you have questions about that, please feel free to reach out to either myself, or I know that your professor is going to cover this in great detail. But look it up. It's really something we should all be aware of. But that plays into those negative emotions around hookups. Now, something that's important to understand beyond just the cultural reason for gender differences is one other take on it. So that's more of the sociological take on it. The evolutionary psychology take on gender differences with short-term mating is what they call it. So I know it's a funny terminology, but in evolutionary psychology terms, hookup sex would be considered short-term mating. So there's long-term mating, like dating, marriage, short-term mating, hookup sex, casual sex. So there's some theories around why there might be gender differences for who is more frequently hooking up, who's more frequently having these short-term mating behaviors, and why it might be easier for men versus women to do this, why men might do this more frequently. So just briefly, because this is not my area of expertise, but it's important to understand that this is a key player in understanding short-term mating with gender. One of the key theories around this is the sexual strategies theory. And Booth and Schmidt developed this in 1993, and it's been continued to be researched throughout the 2000s. And it's been challenged, but this is the predominant theory around short-term mating and gender differences. So generally, the idea is that men and women have different reasons as far as adaptation for seeking short-term mating relationships, like hookups. And in general, the idea is that short-term mating is more adaptive or more beneficial for men in the long term than it is for women. So when we talk about evolutionary psychology, we're talking about what helps the species continue and what is adaptive for the species overall, not for the individual. So that's kind of what they're talking about, saying this is more beneficial to men when we're talking about carrying on the human race, is what they mean, not like psychologically beneficial. So what they mean by that, as far as evolutionary theory, is that for men, identifying sexually available and fertile women who they can then pass on their lineage to and create new life is very important. And hookup sex and things like this short-term mating actually helps them to identify sexually available women. They can have more sexual partners than they would in long-term mating when you can only have one at a time, like monogamy. And they would have lower levels of investment or commitment to each partner. So not having to financially support, not having to give as much time. And so the idea is they'd be able to identify and then impregnate multiple women and carry on the human race in a way that's more adaptive than having one partner for many, many years. So this is the evolutionary psychology theory around this. For women, the only adaptive reasons for having short-term mating strategies would be if you wanted to change mates. So if the mate you're with is not going to be able to provide you with children, or is not providing for you, you might want to switch. Short-term mating, like hookup sex, could help with that. Evaluating the long-term potential in a short-term mate. So the idea is for women, long-term relationships, as far as evolutionary theory, long-term relationships are actually better because they have security for the children they're having and raising. So for women, evolutionarily, they would like to prefer long-term mating, and that's what the theory is saying. So women tend to prefer long-term because they have children, and their mate helps them to have these children and support them and keep them healthy so they can live. For men, it doesn't make sense to do long-term mating, so they could do many, many different partners with short-term mating. This is one theory. It's good to remember that. It kind of helps us to understand why might men in some ways just be more likely and more comfortable doing this. It might be just generally helpful for us to understand their sexual strategies and their behavior. But other people have challenged this, and they say that the gender differences in short-term and long-term mating are not that dramatic. We don't have all men over here in like short-term mating, and that's what's adaptive, and all women are over here in long-term mating, and that's what's adaptive. Other people say depends on the time of life and depends on the situation in which a man or woman finds themselves. And typically men might find themselves in the situation where this is adaptive more often than women, but women can utilize short-term mating or long-term mating, and men can utilize short-term mating or long-term mating. So there's kind of people who have challenged this over time, but it's just an interesting thing to think about, gender differences as far as evolutionary theory. Again, I think the sexual double standard in our culture today is one of the predominant reasons why we're seeing differences, and I definitely think that that is something to heavily consider. This is another perspective, however, as to why there might be gender differences. Okay, so looking at that final piece, so we talked about what are the 3 reasons why people could have negative emotions after a hookup. We talked about alcohol use, we talked about gender differences, and then we're talking now about norms. So cultural norms around sexuality in this generation and recent generations, and more traditional and religiously based sexual norms and the clash between those two. So first, looking at current emerging adults, this generation, and their sexual norms, research shows that we have a continually increasingly sexually permissive generation. So attitudes, not actual behavior, but we're seeing increasingly permissive attitudes. People are more okay with casual sex or uncommitted sex. We are seeing earlier and more frequent sexual behavior among emerging adults, so people are having sex sooner and more often. And we're also seeing an increase in premarital cohabitation. So people aren't waiting for marriage to live together and to have sex. That's just what the research is showing. What are the religious norms this doesn't seem to be aligned with, that I'm saying are clashing? We know that most religious traditions have some restrictive teachings about sexual morality. And we know that there's a range of teachings between and within traditions. So we're not saying all religions teach that sex outside of a committed relationship is bad. We're just saying that in general, across several different Judeo-Christian and Islamic and several other traditions, there are some rules around sexuality. And most of those rules put some sort of emphasis on marriage, or at least on a committed relationship. So traditionally, if marriage was kind of the bar for morality with sexuality, then below that would be a committed relationship that's maybe not marriage, but then uncommitted sexuality would kind of be even more difficult to understand from a religious norm perspective. And so because of this, a lot of religions, while some of them are becoming more progressive and are much more sex positive, there's still plenty of religious traditions that are teaching that sex before marriage is wrong, or are teaching that sex not in a committed relationship is not right. And so we can see that, we might think, well, most people who are hooking up aren't religious, right? So it doesn't really matter. That's what I was wondering. And in my study and a lot of other studies, researchers have found no. Actually, plenty of people who are religious, adolescents and emerging adults, do end up having hookup sex. They're part of that culture. They're part of both cultures. And they're trying to navigate both. And that can be tricky. And that can lead to some negative emotions about themselves and about their behavior. So we see from basic research that just being more religious and having more religious behavior does inhibit your sexual behavior as an adolescent and as an emerging adult. So the more religious you are, the less frequently you have sex, the fewer partners you have, and the higher the age of your first sexual encounter. But we do see that over half of adolescents who report high religiousness also endorse having sex. So exactly what I was just saying. They're holding these beliefs, and it does inhibit generally, but we still see teens who are very religious are still engaging in sex and most likely uncommitted sex in some cases. For emerging adults, so college students fall in that category, we're seeing that religion and spirituality leads to less premarital sexual behavior, and attending religious services more often and having them be more important to you makes sex less likely, just in general. So we do know that overall, globally, having stronger religious beliefs and behavior does inhibit sexual behavior. And so this would likely kind of translate over into hookup sex. So what do we see? What do we see when we study emerging adults? What is their religiousness and what is their religious attitude and attendance? How is that relating to hookup sex? We see that young adults with higher religious attendance tend to hold less permissive attitudes about hookup sex, and they're less likely to engage in it. So we see that inhibition with hookup sex as well. However, again, we still have that percentage who are still hooking up, and that might be where some of those negative emotions are coming from. Again, if you look at other kinds of variables like biblical conservatism, so just meaning how much do you believe that the Bible is the Word of God, that and religious service attendance are also tied to lower hookup behavior scores. So you're less likely to be hooking up, and if you are, you're not maybe hooking up quite as much as your peers. Interestingly, something that I found in my study is that for women who were more biblically conservative or very involved in a religious tradition, might still engage in low levels of hookup sex. And what I mean by this is maybe the lower levels of sexual behavior like touching, kissing, and maybe not all the way to intercourse. So they would be deemed kind of on the lower end of the hookup behavior spectrum. However, they're experiencing high levels of struggles around their religious and spirituality regarding that behavior. So a lot of my research is on religious and spiritual struggles, so meaning struggles with your beliefs around religion, struggles with your relationship with God or a higher power, and looking at how those struggles relate to hookup sex and that kind of behavior. So somebody else who kind of did this in a more detailed way is Donna Freitas. She wrote a book, Sex and the Soul. So if this is interesting to you at all, I tell you to check it out because it's really in-depth and really interesting. She looked at and she interviewed a whole lot of college students about their hookup experiences. And then out of these interviews, she drew a whole lot of different themes that could be analyzed. So it was more of a qualitative study, but very, very interesting, and definitely laid the groundwork for the study that I performed. So really interesting. These are a couple of quotes that also reflect, again, just this theme that hookup sex can be so different depending on the person, their beliefs, and their beliefs about sexuality, their beliefs about religion and sexuality. So many different things can shape it, and it can be either a really negative experience, a very confusing experience, very positive experience. So you see this here. The first one says, I feel bad about myself, like a sleaze. Disgusted with my decision. It's not consistent with what I believe. I feel empty. I wonder, does the other guy really want more? Was it just sex? And if it was I an object? I degraded myself. Even if it was meaningful, I should have waited until we were in an intimate relationship. So you see all of those themes we were talking about, the regret, feeling used, confused, and maybe thinking about wanting a more committed relationship. The second one here, though, in contrast, says, sometimes I feel really proud of myself. When I look at my partner, I often think, I did that? Or, this again. Should I leave now? Should I write a thank you note? Quite often, I suppose I just feel a bit empty. As for my actions, well, they were always clumsy and stupid, but that's what makes the humiliating grin fun the day after. So this person is describing it as fun, a little bit confusing at times, but overall, usually feeling pretty good. But also a good representation of the mixed experience too. So a great book if you're interested in this at all. This is from my study, so I also asked people for their general reactions to their most recent hookup experience, and I got a lot of different ones that I put into a couple different categories. So we have those examples of guilt and feelings of disgust. We have examples of feeling distant or judged by God or by other people. Questioning, just wondering, was it a big deal? Is it okay? Dissonance, so feeling like I'm trying to be religious and my religion is against hooking up, and yet I'm hooking up, and just feeling very confused about how to reconcile those two. Some people feel closer to God, and some people feel like it's unrelated. They feel like I love God, we're good, I don't have any struggles, and yet I'm hooking up. That's fine. And then we have people who even say, I think it makes me more spiritual to be hooking up. That's, I would say, definitely the minority. So there's more in these judgment, guilt, regret, dissonance categories for sure. But just an example that people vary in their reactions to hookup sex. So just a final note, so in the study that I performed looking at those religious and spiritual struggles, so things that might get in the way in one's religious and spiritual life because of hookup behavior, I saw that hookups can bring up religious and spiritual struggles because a lot of people are part of religions that have teachings about non-marital sexuality, and in particular about uncommitted sexuality. Both men and women, their most highly endorsed type of struggle was moral struggle. So wondering, is this right? But women reported significantly higher moral struggles than did men. And so that goes back to that sexual double standard, right? They're performing the same behavior, but women are wondering doubly, is this wrong? Did I do something wrong? We know that women also tend to be more religious than do men. I didn't go into that too much in this lecture, but that's something the research shows. And again, with the sexual double standard and more exposure to religious culture, you would see that they would also be more affected by it. And we finally see that religious and spiritual struggles around hookup sex can be linked with poorer psychological outcomes like depression and anxiety, riskier substance use, more alcohol use, and riskier sexual behavior like not using a condom during intercourse. So again, just kind of going back, we know that hookup sex is a pretty prevalent experience for college students. Between 40 to 60% have at least one hookup experience. However, we know that the reactions to hooking up can vastly vary based on one's context, one's belief systems, and whether or not one was using alcohol beforehand. There's so many different things that can impact this. So, the way that I approach the psychology of hooking up is thinking about each individual and, their needs and their reactions, rather than pegging hookup sex as helpful or unhelpful, good or bad. Just looking at it from the perspective of, within this person's life, is this something that is helpful or harmful for them? And at times, it can be a mix of both. It's an interesting phenomenon. If you have any more interest in studying this or learning more about it, feel free to reach out to me. I'd be happy to talk to anybody about this, or about religion and sexuality, which is another area of interest for me. Again, my name's Dr. Julie Pomerlow, and I'm a clinical psychology PhD graduate from Bowling Green, and it was a pleasure speaking with you today. Thank you.